Hi, good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Pat Kenny. I'm the Dean of the College, and it's a real joy to welcome all of you to the annual John P. Frank Memorial Lecture in person here at the university. Yeah, let's have a round of applause for that. As you all know, it's been a very challenging couple years, but the university is moving in a direction now where we're doing more events like this. We're welcoming top-tier speakers like you're going to hear tonight. And we feel good about the setting. We feel good about the safety for everyone, so we really appreciate you coming. We appreciate you spending time here, and welcome to the university. Welcome also to this very prestigious lecture series. And I can say, because it's I think the college has, this is my role, I'm going to say it anyway. I think the college has the best lecture series across the university. None of the other deans are here tonight, so I'm comfortable saying that. But it's actually true. It is true. And this one is a premier lecture. I'm standing by it. It's a premier lecture, and it's really a marquee lecture. And many of you have come to many of these, and you know how good they are. Okay? Also, the Friends of John Frank have done an outstanding job raising resources over the years, and just last spring we learned that the endowment, the original endowment, had been completed, which is not a small task, but it gives the university, it gives the school and the college a lot of flexibility with that. And we sat and talked with the leadership in the school, and we'll be able to do a range of things moving forward. We could have visitors here for a very short time. They could be here for longer periods of time. They could even be a visiting professor for an entire semester. Yeah, and we believe, actually, that with further fundraising, so we're not stopping the fundraising, with further fundraising, we could probably extend over a year or bring more than one speaker throughout the year. Okay, so you've been so successful with this. You can really see that it's starting to pay off, and we're going to be able to do more things and introduce speakers like you'll see tonight to more and more of the community, and in particular to our students, right? So that's a tremendous thing. I always read this because he was so outstanding that I don't want to make mistakes. So the evening here we gather to honor John P. Frank, who was a lawyer, constitutional scholar, historian, author of 11 books, including a biography of Justice Hugo Black, for whom he was a clerk. Generous advisor to people like Anita Hill, for example, during the Clarence Thomas hearings. And she was a guest speaker in this series in 2018. He also was a mentor to many in the legal profession, including our own former governor and then Secretary Janet Napolitano, who was our guest speaker in 2010. Over the course of his long career, he influenced public policy in Arizona and across the United States. He helped shape the argument in the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision, and took the Miranda v. Arizona case all the way to the Supreme Court. He advanced critical First Amendment, labor, and desegregation cases. Tonight, he would be excited, I think, and interested and want to hear what you're going to hear, given what's going on across Europe and having implications across the world. It's always my pleasure to introduce, and I think I've done this a couple times, to introduce his daughter, Karen Frank, who will take over the mic here and continue on. So thanks much, and enjoy the evening.
Good evening. As Pat said, I'm Karen Frank. I am one of the proud daughters of John Frank. And it's always just so wonderful to be able to remember him to other people, and also really an honor for me to be associated in even a small way with all of the different amazing speakers who have been a part of this lecture series for for 22 years. Is that right? So I want to thank the university and the School of Social Transformation for sticking with this and supporting it and raising money and keeping it so vibrant. And also thank the planning committee, the friends of my dad, the law firm of Lewis and Roca, and Susan Freeman said I don't have to say the whole long name of the thing anymore, for all that you've done. And also wanted to just remember Joe McGarry, who was my father's colleague and friend for more than 50 years and was a founder of this lecture series. And I guess this is the first time Joe's not with us, so we remember Joe. So I've been thinking about heroes these days, and I looked it up. The definition of a hero is a person of immense courage and major accomplishment and noble purpose. I would say President Zelensky of Ukraine is clearly a hero of the moment, right? But there are many others, and we are so honored to have a hero with us tonight who has been a truth teller at great personal risk. And I just would like to say what an honor to meet you and have you be here and share your thoughts with us tonight. And I'll turn it over to Camilla.
Thank you. So I'm Camilo Fohas, and I am the very new director of the School of Social Transformation here at ASU. And just a few words about the school. It's really the first of its kind, and it hosts this lecture series. And the school, you know, I think its mission is more important than ever, given the sort of dizzying transformations across the globe and the crises that we're currently facing. And it brings together a diverse group of scholars. Some of you have been students. Oh, bring it. Okay, maybe I'm going to have to actually do some karaoke here. Okay. So it brings together a number of scholars from different units. So we have African American Studies, Asian Pacific American Studies, Gender Studies. We have certificates in Disability Studies, Social and Cultural Pedagogy, Justice and Social Inquiry that's hosting the event tonight. And the school in general promotes justice, equality, and equity through research, teaching, and community collaboration, inspiring students to generate creative approaches to persistent social challenges. So we're really grateful to the members of the John P. Frank family, colleagues, mentees, and friends, faculty and staff from the School of Social Transformation. Many of them herded you in here tonight and have helped us to shepherd this entire process along. We're also grateful to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and the statewide nonprofit organization Arizona Humanities for making this evening's event possible. We are honored to serve as the home for this signature event and invite you to enjoy our program. So this evening we have two co-hosts. This will be a conversation. We have Tracy Fessenden from the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and Madeline Edelman, representing the School of Social Transformation. They will join in conversation with our esteemed guest, Masha Gessen. So it really is truly, truly an honor to have Masha Gessen here with us today. Masha is an intrepid critic, activist, journalist, and award-winning author. They provide perhaps the most thoughtful and incisive analysis of democratic institutions and challenges to them in our contemporary moment. As author of 11 books, they have covered political subjects from Russia, autocracy, LGBTQ rights, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump, among other topics. And their understanding of events and forces that have wracked Russia in recent times is unparalleled, documented most recently in the National Book Award winning The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. They are author of the New York Times bestseller, The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, the chilling account of how a low-level, small-minded KGB operative ascended to the Russian presidency. destroying years of progress and putting an end to the promise of democracy. And most recently, Surviving Autocracy, a guide to our contemporary moment of autocratic rule, the book-length counterpart to their 2016 viral article, Autocracy Rules for Survival. So in the spirit of elucidating mysteries, Gessen has been a science journalist covering AIDS, medical genetics, and mathematics. Their 2008 book, Blood Matters, From Inherited Illness to Designer Babies, How the World and I Found Ourselves in the Future of the Gene, explores the way genetic information shapes decisions we make. They also wrote Perfect Rigor, a genius in the mathematical breakthrough of the century, on the elusive Russian mathematician Grigory Perelman. So a regular contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, Harper's, the New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, and Slate, among many other publications, Gessen is a staff writer at The New Yorker. They have taught at Amherst and Oberlin colleges and currently serve on the faculty at Bard College. The recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Nieman Fellowship, the Hitchens Prize, and the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Commentary, Gessen has lived in New York since 2013, after more than 20 years as a journalist and editor in Moscow. You can see why this is all written. I could not extemporize on this. Gessen will present their thoughts on the state of democracy and the pursuit of justice. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Masha Gessen, Madeline Edelman, and Tracy Fessenden. Thank you.
We're so glad to be here. We're so glad to be here and that you're here too. This is working, right? Okay. I just want to say a couple words to say thank you to the folks who are here with me on the stage and to remind you that there are some index cards that are going around for you to submit your questions. There'll be people who will be asking you to fold them and probably bring them to the center or put them in a basket, however that works. And so we'll have a short period of time for some public dialogue as well.
I'll begin. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Masha Gessen, for being with us. And I want to thank all the people who are out in front and also behind the scenes who made tonight possible. Better? Okay.
All right.
Masha, you've described Americans today as heirs to a degraded sense of truth, meaning, and possibility. And this resonates so powerfully with so many of us. I want to invite you to say more about what you mean. You've mentioned that this is rather recent. We've gone in less than a decade from a nation of immigrants, perhaps, to squabbling over a border wall, among other things. Why is it important to acknowledge our degraded sense of truth in particular, and how might we begin the work of repair?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Karen, for the kind words, and thank you for having me. This is my first in-person event in more than 2 years. So this is like, this calls for celebration. So, you know, I think I was writing probably, if I said we're heirs to a degraded sense of truth about the aftermath of the Trump presidency. Because I think there's a real temptation to, and the administration, the current administration bears some responsibility for this, there's always a temptation to think about our current moment as a kind of return to normalcy. There was a 4-year nightmare when we kind of lost our minds for a little bit, and now we're back to normal. And I think that there are a lot of things wrong with that understanding, but one of them is that we really have to be aware of how damaged our political conversation has become, right? And we see this all the time, even now, in the way that the different politicians and different media are reacting to the war in Ukraine. There's a real undercurrent of nothing is true. Going through the commentary on Fox News or comments made by some Trump Republicans, and that's not to be underestimated, right? We have this problem of not inhabiting a shared reality, and I don't want it to sound like I'm making an equivalency between two sides of this of this problem, right? The two polar opposites in this situation. There is a large part of this country, probably still a majority of people who are regularly exposed to opinions that they don't share. Right? If you are a consumer of legacy media, you actually, if you read the New York Times, you see a very wide range of opinions. I might have issues with just how they choose that range, right? But it's a wide range of opinions. You're going to open a newspaper and you're going to see opinions that you don't share. The same thing is going to happen to you if you listen to NPR. Perhaps less so with something like MSNBC, and I think that's a problem, right? But then we have a giant information bubble on the other side of people who are never, except maybe in some conversations with their relatives, exposed to opinions that they don't share. And that's basically a problem of totalitarian ideology, and we have to have completely different ways of thinking about it and of inventing things to do with it.
So following up on that, what kind of role can we play, what can we pay attention to in terms of protecting journalism specifically and legacy and new forms of media in particular?
By we, do you mean us three, or? I think we have a problem in this country, which is not unique to this country, but we're perhaps uniquely attached to it, and that is that we have entrusted our public sphere to an ever-decreasing number of profit-making corporations. There was a period of time, particularly after World War II, when there was this amazing, almost magical sort of confluence where advertisers needed vehicles that also served local communities by providing news for them. Right? Regulation played a role in this, but it was also a strange, it was a miracle. But there's nothing logical about, thank you. There's nothing logical about believing that profit-making vehicles are a good way to guarantee what we refer to as the fourth estate, the fourth branch of government. We don't expect the Senate to rent out rooms to be able to do its job for the country because it needs to be self-sufficient. And we're incredibly reluctant to talk about, and I encounter this with my students all the time, where I used to teach a course regularly on on thinking about the media and on Trump and the media, and about halfway through the semester, I would say, okay, now we've read a lot of media criticism, but we've read a lot of criticism of the contemporary model of American media. Let's start thinking about what it could be. Let's talk about publicly funded media. And these students who had been fully engaged for 6 weeks with the criticism of the profit-making model would suddenly recoil. Say, no, that would bring censorship. Really? You really trust Mark Zuckerberg more than you trust, say, a panel of people, or a system that we would create to make sure that taxpayers' money is spent properly. It's not risk-free, but it's obviously a system that at least suggests a kind of accountability, right? So that's where we start, right? We start, we can't start with sort of small steps to make it a little bit easier for existing media to exist, right? We have lost more than half of our local media. We have seen almost a complete disappearance of local news, even in places that still have local media. And I think that means we've seen a disappearance of a huge chunk of the political conversation. Right? If you don't know what's going on, news. One definition of news that I really like is news is what happens in your community when you're not looking. And what happens, I do like it that people feel like what happens in Ukraine is part of what happens in their community. But for the future of this country, I think it's even more important for people to know what happens on their street or in their school board.
We have seen a slight renaissance of some local media here, at least in Arizona, but I think there's only one reporter who consistently covers our state legislature, which means we really don't know what's going on down the street. In 2016, you famously or infamously said, don't rely on institutions to protect us because they can change so very quickly. So we've certainly seen efforts to undermine our electoral, our judicial, our legislative branches. Would you update your claim, your statement for today, for 2022, and help us through that?
Yeah, I mean, that was from this essay, Surviving Autocracy. It wasn't actually called Surviving Autocracy. It was called something similar. Autocracy Rules for Survival. And so one of those rules was your institutions will not save you. And the reason I wrote that at the time was that I remember when I was talking to people about what had started to look like the very real possibility of Donald Trump getting elected. There were a number of stages that people psychologically went through in the run-up to the election. Stage one was Republicans will never nominate him. Stage two was Americans will never elect him. Stage three was even if Americans elect him, our institutions are strong enough. And I have to admit that at first I would sort of nod along and think, yeah, this is a very different country than what I'm used to. So of course, American institutions have a great tradition and have a great story and are very much a part of American identity. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that belief in institutions as though there was something outside of society and outside of politics and outside of ourselves is actually incredibly dangerous, right? It's this idea that, and I think of it sometimes as Americans' idea of democracy as a kind of self-repairing machine, right? Where we built the perfect democracy. And now it's going to run itself. And if it's not running itself, then there's something wrong with one of the things that we did that don't conform to the original design. Right? And institutions only function to the extent that society wants them to function and in the ways that society enables them to function, right? And, a great example of American institutions working very well, we saw in January 2017 after the initial travel ban, when it was like this sort of textbook example of civil society functioning. People came out to protest. But professional civil society also kicked into high gear, and there were immediately lawsuits filed, and at the same time people were camping out at airports, right? And you could see from the grassroots to the professionals that civil society was in action, and that's what guaranteed a series of fast and decisive court rulings, both on the district level and ultimately on the level of the Supreme Court. By the time we got to Travel Ban 3.0, which was basically the same travel ban, civil society wasn't doing its thing to the same extent, and that travel ban was allowed to stand. And if nothing else, right, that is an amazing example of how civil society and public opinion and media enable institutions, but also enable their dysfunction when they're not paying attention, when we're not paying attention.
I want to ask a question about Putin's anti-LGBTQ playbook. But before I do, could you just, because I remember that so well, feeling really some hope when law students went to airports and camped out. And what happened between the travel ban and travel ban 2.0? What made, because you're right, I mean, we didn't see that again. So what would you say happened or didn't happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that that a couple of things happened. One is that we had a really bad faith actor on the other side of this, right? In the way that Americans imagine that our institutions work, that Supreme Court decision would have been the end of that particular chapter of the Trump story. Trump related to the Supreme Court not in the way that most previous presidents have related to it. He related to it as a developer relates to the zoning board. Okay, if they say no the first time, which they normally do, then I'm going to find a way, a workaround, right? This is what they said was wrong with this. It appeared to be religiously based. Let's throw a couple of other countries in there. Who cares? It's not just bad faith acting. It's a completely different way of relating to the law and to institutions, right? And that's part of the reason that also I said, your institutions will not save you, because institutions are completely dependent on a consensus on both sides or many sides that are appealing to an institution, agreeing with each other to respect the institution, right? So I think part of it was that it worked, and then there just wasn't sort of the bandwidth or even the realization that it worked, but it didn't work all the way. Took a while to dawn on people. I think people were also really distracted by a lot of other things. And I think, remember during the Trump era, we were all constantly worried that we were paying attention to one shiny object and something else was going on. And I think that, first of all, that was merit to that worry. We're always paying attention to some new shiny object. But there's also a way in which autocratic leaders work, which is that they create this constant sort of state of anxiety that is really debilitating, and it's one of the hardest things to do in it is organize.
Let me ask now about your decision to leave Russia. You wrote a decade ago that when Putin came for queer families, it was time to get yours out. So tell us more about the role of Putin's anti-LGBTQ campaign in the authoritarian playbook, and particularly in now the current war on Ukraine.
So, this is something that's now much easier, I think, to talk about than it used to be when I first had to leave Russia, when I first had to leave Russia the second time at the end of 2013. Because when I got here, this was the middle of, or actually even the beginning of Obama's second term, and it was such sort of an incredible moment for the LGBT rights movement here that it was almost unimaginable that another place was going so strongly in reverse. Now we understand how this works, right? And the way it works is that autocratic politics is almost always past-oriented. There's always a story that the autocrat is telling, which plays into people's anxieties about the future, about how fast things are changing, how they just can't imagine themselves and their kids in the world that's going to exist 10, 15 years from now. And along comes the autocrat and says, I can take you back to the past in which you felt comfortable, when you knew who you were and who your family was and what your future held, and you felt stable, right? Stability is always a really big word for autocrats. And that's people will give a lot for that. People will give up their freedom, a lot of people will give up their freedom in exchange for being promised stability and comfort and a return to an imaginary past. And in order to show that they mean it, but also just to sort of to symbolize this reversal of social change, they have to go for whatever was the fastest and most visible social change. And in much of the world, that's advances in LGBT rights. And so for Putin, this is something that he's stumbled upon after the mass protests of 2011, 2012, when he realized that he could queerbait the protesters, but he could also use the image of LGBT people to symbolize the West, to symbolize rapid social change, to say to people, you know, if you want to go back to a time when there were no queer people and you weren't expected to accept them, well, you laugh, right? But there were no gay people in the Soviet Union, right? Not a joke. There were people who had sex with members of the same sex, there were people who certainly did not conform to gender expectations, but they did not claim a group identity, and they did not claim to have rights that accrued to them because they belonged to a group, right? So this is actually something that he could point to and say, look, early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we started doing all sorts of things that made you really uncomfortable. Remember, you became poor, the streets became dangerous, crime was on the rise, the trains didn't run on time. And one symbol of this is that something that was completely unknown, completely unfamiliar, this idea of LGBT people and their rights. Like, it stands for all of that. And I can take you back to before that happened. And on a somewhat milder scale, because it wasn't quite as drastic in this country, and because Donald Trump couldn't say, you know, that LGBT rights was brought in from somewhere else, but the way that he went immediately for trans rights, right? Among his very first acts were the travel ban, and then very soon after that, the ban on trans people in the military, right? And it's this almost automatic impulse to start reversing from the point of social change that we have arrived at. And now, just one final thing. Now you rights as an issue in this war against Ukraine, because Ukraine is a symbol of how the West wants to usurp Russia and force its values down Russia's throat. And Ukraine is an example of a place where that's happened, that is much more accepting of LGBT people than Russia is. And so see, it's gay Europa, and we have to fight it, because that's a fight for our survival.
So we see now a surge in anti-LGBTQ initiatives in various state legislatures, including our own, I'm sure, if we had any coverage of what's happening down there. But what are these two movements in conversation? Was the American religious right a player in Putin's anti-LGBTQ stuff? Is some of the stuff that we're seeing now playing into Putin's goals, or do you see them as just parallel tracks?
You know, in conversation, I think, is the exact right term. So in 2016, I went to Tbilisi to cover the World Congress of Families, which is this gathering of activists for traditional values, so-called, from all over the world. And one of the reasons that I wanted to go cover it was because there were such different stories that were circulating about it. One was the story that American Christian right was exporting its wares because it was no longer sort of accepted and powerful here. It was exporting its wares to Russia and Eastern Europe. And the other story was that Russia was cementing an international coalition of so-called traditional values countries, the traditional values civilization, and was actually the muscle behind a lot of these extremely anti-LGBT initiatives in Africa, in the Middle East, in the UN. There are constant measures coming up from this very odd coalition of countries. So I kind of wanted to find out whether it was America or Russia. And, I went there and, first of all, they let me in, which was kind of amazing. And they actually, to their credit, were, the Russians refused to talk to me mostly, but the Americans were kind of following the, all publicity is good publicity playbook, and were, I think, significantly open with me about the history of their organizations and sort of their worldviews. It was really creepy. I've never spent a few days just hanging out with gay bashers, right? There were, one of the events, and this was, I think, most traumatic for me, one of the events of this conference was a march through the streets of Tbilisi that was literally led by people who had bashed participants in a gay pride parade just a couple of weeks earlier. And so for reporting purposes, I walked with these Americans and Russians who were participating in this march for family values. So what I observed was a meeting of the minds. Were people who came from all over the world, from the States and from European countries and from Russia and from Australia and New Zealand, who felt to some extent or to a great extent marginalized in their own societies, some with better reason than others, Russians certainly with no reason, but there's this real grievance narrative that is very dominant in this movement, and that shared very different kinds, but sort of in the same tonality of demographic panic in their countries, all of which were changing to some extent or another, and they placed a lot of that because for most of them, they realized that it's obscene to talk about race, so they placed that resentment on LGBT people. For some of them don't care, and we'll talk about race openly or the looming genocide of white people. But my ultimate conclusion was that they are in conversation. When Russia was passing its anti-gay laws in June of 2013, a delegation of Americans with legislative experience flew to jump right in and help them pass a couple of more bills right there, right then, and they did. And then Russia was just a lot of the money behind this effort.
It makes me think about the possibilities for solidarity, potentially through empathy, when one group is being cordoned off as the other. I watched a documentary called Winter on Fire, which was about Ukraine in 2014. And there was a moment in the film where there was a commentator saying religion melted away, ethnicity, nationality in some ways melted away. We were all here together, right? And I'm curious, what kind of possibilities have you seen where people have had those differences melt away, where maybe they aren't the ones being targeted, but somehow there's a possibility for solidarity and unity?
Well, actually, when Russia passed its anti-gay laws, there was a real perceptible shift in the sort of the larger community of people where I lived. Right? It's not I don't mean my building, although my building was like a small case in point because. I'd lived in this building in the center of Moscow for, I guess, 15 years by that point. And really from the time my then partner and I brought home our adopted son, all the people in the building just accepted us. I think they thought of us as weirdos before. And it was the most amazing thing. It was 2001. It was the year 2000. Yeah, it was the year 2000, and we came home from this trip to pick him up, and there were balloons on our door, and every neighbor stopped by and brought us something or offered some kind of help. It was really lovely. And something similar happened in the larger community, like the media community and the organizing community, which had been fairly homophobic, not hateful in the way that the Kremlin was becoming, but certainly kind of marginalizing of LGBT issues, dismissive of them, and sometimes outright homophobic, and that just completely disappeared. And I was talking to one person who just said, you know, every decent person now is pro-LGBT rights. Because when you have to choose sides, you have to choose sides. So I think that's one thing that happens, and actually the result has been stable. It changed in that small community, in the sort of the civil society sector. It really changed everything for good. And in Ukraine, I saw the same thing. Certainly during the revolution of 2013, 2014, it wasn't just that religion melted away and political differences melted away, but sexual orientation and views on LGBT rights melted away. They then came right back in and had to be confronted again. But they had to be confronted, or they could be confronted based on this history of shared struggle, and that made a huge difference. Right? There were a few years for LGBT activists in Ukraine that were very difficult post-Maidan, when they were kind of negotiating that story, because it was a very conservative society, but LGBT activists had been very prominent in the Maidan, and then the right wing just kind of became more politically powerful for a while. And it always felt like the wrong time to bring up LGBT rights, because the country was still fighting for its survival. It was involved in the first war. And then they finally made a decision to force the issue and kind of appeal to that history of shared struggle and their role in the revolution. And I think there was a real breakthrough.
It sounds like empathy is the result, not the cause. You gain the empathy through the shared struggle, but it's not just sharing your story for its own sake. There has to be something shared in the experience itself.
I think it probably can work both ways, but I think that that when you have had the experience of shared struggle, it's a lot easier. And you know, that experience of a unifying national story, I mean, that's part of what the whole world is now seeing in Ukraine, right? The power of that. I had this amazing conversation. I mean, this is getting a little bit away from your question, but more to the first question you asked. I had this incredible conversation at the end of January in Kyiv when I was talking to a journalist, and there was still, you know, this was like this weird week when the New York Times was reporting every day on how the invasion was imminent. And everyone I knew in Ukraine was saying, oh, come on, that's silly. That's not going to happen. And yet there was also people who were gathering supplies and sort of stocking up on gasoline and grains and making tentative plans for what they were going to do if the invasion happened. And I was talking to this woman, Natalia Humenyuk, who is a terrific Ukrainian journalist who runs a center for public journalism in Ukraine. And what they do is they research the possibility of creating content that reaches people across ideological divides. So they like test drive different approaches to content creation. It's a really great project. And she just kind of made this offhand remark. She said, well, we learned this, and then, you know, we looked at the studies in the States. But, you know, fortunately, Ukrainian society isn't nearly as polarized as American society. And, I mean, which, it's not very often, even I don't very often see this kind of somebody in a different country referring to the United States as a cautionary tale example, right? Like, we're not that far gone. She was absolutely right. I mean, all the data point to her being right, and I think she's right. And you can see it now, right? You can see what a society with a unified sense, a common sense of reality, a unifying national story, what that looks like.
Trump is no longer in the White House, but Trump is still very much with us, as is Trumpism. And you, Masha Gessen, saw this coming before most of us did, I think. I'm wondering what about your experience in Russia made you see Trumpism before Trump was installed in the White House, and what are the conditions that make a Trump possible that you were able to zero in on, and are those to invoke your friend's point about America's cautionary tale, how likely are we to see an end to Trumpism anytime soon?
I try not to make predictions. Let's see if I can. But I think there are four things I want to say in response to that question. One is sort of what made it possible for me to see. I think partly it's just being an exile or a foreigner. I think exiles in general have a richer political imagination, both catastrophic imagination and but also in the good case scenarios also a creative political imagination. I've been working forever on this book that is going to change again because of the war, but it's on imaginative political projects, and I thought in the process of writing this book that maybe I should just write a book about exiles, right? Because so many of these imaginative political projects are in one way or another tied to people who went from one place to another and had this outside perspective on how the new place was constituted, but also had maybe a sense of disappointment because they were going to someplace with great hope, and but also the knowledge that things weren't always done in one way, and this refusal to sort of naturalize things as having always been so and always going to be so. So I think that's part of it. I just have a better catastrophic imagination. Another is that I did spend many years writing about Vladimir Putin and observing him closely, but also observing closely the dynamics of his rise to power and the kinds of things that he was tapping into. I had also just finished writing The Future is History, which is a book about how totalitarianism is reconjured. And so I thought, well, this seems very relevant. I've learned to think about this stuff, and that goes to your question about what makes a Trump possible. I think what makes a Trump possible is a fear of the future. I think that that the best writer on this is the social psychologist Erich Fromm, who wrote this wonderful, very accessible book in 1940 called Escape from Freedom, in which he argued that there at certain times in human history, people, a critical mass of people have such anxiety about the future because it becomes so unimaginable that they will trade their agency for a guarantee of return to the imaginary past, which is something I've already referred to. And so there was so much anxiety in this country. And sometimes it's easier to talk about this anxiety as racism or purely as economic anxiety, but it's all of that. It's demographic panic, it's economic anxiety, and it is, and a lot of it is based in very real, in a very real sense of just profound homelessness and lostness. And of course, in the world, the mass displacement of people in this century has also played a huge role, as it did in the totalitarianisms of the 20th century. So how do we get rid of it? We need a future-oriented politics. I don't think there's another way, right? The idea that you could vote Trump out of the White House and go back to normal, I think is extremely dangerous, if not just outright crazy, right? there are real fears and anxieties that brought Trump to office, and one of the reasons that they brought him to office is that he was the only politician who was speaking to those anxieties. And we still don't see much of the Democratic Party speaking directly to those anxieties.
You're speaking now to the emotional side of politics, which seems to be at the heart of what we need to confront. I want to bring our attention to a more materialist approach, perhaps, and thinking about what some have called a transnational crime syndicate. You've written extensively about systemic corruption that are perpetrated by those charged with upholding the rule of law, whether or not people believe in the law or that it's a mirage of some kind, but those are the people who are involved in the corruption. And some people have called this, in an authoritarian state, it's a transnational crime syndicate. So can you tell us where that line between corruption and authoritarianism meets? How do they work together? And where is that happening now, maybe in places that might not seem so obvious to us?
I don't know. I'm always a little hesitant to talk about corruption because certainly in Russia, it was always easier to try to fight corruption than to try to fight what was actually wrong with the regime, I think. And which is not to say that the Russian regime is not fantabulously corrupt. I mean, it is like a great big sort of suction hose in the body of the country that just that just keeps vacuuming up people's money and material goods for the sake of a few wealthy men. But I've had an argument with Alexei Navalny, the absolutely heroic, amazing Russian anti-corruption campaigner, about whether that was primary. And the last time we talked about it was actually after he recovered from his poisoning, and I said, well, look, like you and I have had this argument, right? I keep saying he is a tyrant and a murderer, and you keep saying he is a crook and a thief. Have you come around to the idea that he's a tyrant and a murderer? And he said no. He kills and terrorizes, or they kill and terrorize people in order to consolidate their wealth. And I think that's a solid argument, but I think it's kind of self-limiting, and what we're seeing now is that Putin is actually willing to take incredible financial losses for the sake of murdering and terrorizing the rest of the world. Right? That's the apogee of his power. Is this? Its brute expression is just terrorizing the world with nuclear arms and inflicting genocide on Ukraine, and that does seem to be more important than the wealth that he accumulated over the decades of being in power. So that's why I'm hesitant to talk about corruption. I'm hesitant to make it the focal point because it's a little bit easier to wrap your mind around, but I don't think it's the thing.
I had a question about Ukraine, but I know that Maddie wanted to ask you a final question before we open things up to the audience. I think we'll have cards.
And I imagine people want to ask about Ukraine, so why don't you go ahead and ask that question after we remind you to pass your cards to the center and to the front so that we can sort through them and have those questions posed to Masha. So, Ladon, if you just raise your hand, if you could get your cards into the center and then down to the front, that'd be great. You just pass them along. People will be good neighbors.
Briefly, I'm sure there'll be more conversation. Has anything surprised you about the last 6 weeks in Ukraine? Is there anything that you weren't expecting that you're seeing? Is there anything we're missing that we should be seeing? And do you have a sense of where this is going?
That's a big question, right? So has anything surprised me? Yeah, I mean, I was really going with the conventional wisdom that, I mean, I was convinced that Putin was going to invade, and I was convinced that his goal was to take all of Ukraine, or at least most of Ukraine, certainly Kyiv and more. I believed the conventional wisdom that overwhelming military force would guarantee him a fairly speedy victory. I was really stupid to believe that, because I've covered previous Russian wars. I covered the first and second war in Chechnya. The first war in Chechnya looked a lot like this war in Ukraine, which is that Yeltsin had been promised by his Minister of Defense that he would take Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, in 2 hours. And then when that failed, and failed catastrophically, failed with huge losses of troops, because they were prosecuting that war exactly the way they tried to prosecute this war in Ukraine, with lots of tanks and few gunshots. And then they started carpet bombing Grozny and just targeting the civilian population, and just prosecuting this punitive genocidal war. But then some military analysts that I know in Russia were saying, no, it's a different army. It's a better trained, better equipped. It's not a mess like it used to be. But apparently, even if it's a different army, it's very much the same army in the way that it thinks about the way the world works, right? And they had this idea that Ukrainians were going to welcome them with open arms, which I knew wasn't true, but I thought they were just going to bomb Ukrainians into submission, and that hasn't happened. And I think it hasn't happened because Ukraine has put up such an incredible fight, and that has surprised me. Maybe it shouldn't have, but it surprised me that I mean, again, I had interviewed people in Ukraine who told me, look, we have the best trained military in Europe, because we've been trying to join NATO. We're not already NATO members, but we've been trying to join NATO, so we've brought everything up to code, right? Up to NATO expectations. We're the most disciplined, the most technologically, maybe not the most technologically advanced, but the most technologically sort of smooth running military in Europe. It appears that was true. But also just incredible courage and resilience of Ukrainian people, right? And maybe sometimes I don't know exactly what people are seeing here, because if I was there, then I didn't see what was here. But the protests, people coming out to protest in the occupied cities, I mean, that just gives me chills, right? And shows what a united and certain of itself nation Ukraine is. So that's the end of the good news. On what my expectations are, I mean, he's not going to stop. I don't expect the negotiations to come to anything. The absolute best case scenario is some kind of temporary partition that Putin agrees to, because they've run out of resources. But that will be a time that he will take to regroup and attack again. The worst case scenario is the use of chemical weapons, which appears to have happened today already, and then the use of nukes.
I'll take the top three that you're going to hand over, and while they're finalizing that, I'm going to read the questions out loud and you can make sense of them.
Okay.
What do you think of John Mensheimer's realpolitik argument that Ukraine's invasion was caused by the West and provocation? And then can you comment on Tim Snyder's article in today's Washington Post on the quote-unquote flattening of Russian culture, and perhaps more specifically on a propaganda piece referenced therein titled, "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine?"
I have to admit, I skimmed Tim Snyder's piece, but I did read "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine" in detail. I don't know what he means by flattening, but I can talk about the piece that opinion piece responds to. And John Mearsheimer has been making this argument about Ukraine since 2014, when he published a big article in Foreign Affairs, sort of saying, look, NATO never should have pushed to the old Soviet border. We knew that was a provocation, and now Putin is quite reasonably looking for a way to feel more secure in Russia, and to not have NATO troops so close to his border. I see two problems with this idea, and they're really, really big problems. One is that it really it takes as its basic assumption that America is the center of the universe, and everything that happens is in some way something that the United States did. And then the second part, and this is my fundamental moral objection to it, is that it completely ignores the fact that every country that joined NATO or asked to join NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Bloc was a country that begged to be admitted to NATO because they really didn't want to be colonized by Russia again, right? Every single country, every single new NATO member or aspiring NATO member like Georgia or Ukraine was a country whose people had the lived experience of being colonized by Russia at least once, in several cases more than once, and wanted to finally join an alliance that would protect them from repeat colonization, which is something that countries in that region in that part of the world know happens all the time, right? And so this sort of the just completely denying subjectivity to these countries and the people who live in them is, to me, morally unacceptable. There was an Ezra Klein interview and Ezra Klein has just been, if you listen to his podcast, he has been absolutely killing it with his coverage of the war in Ukraine. But there was a young realist political scientist who was sort of channeling Mearsheimer in a way that for the first time made me understand the merits of that approach, to be fair, right? Which is that it's at least an approach that imagines that there's the possibility of negotiation and resolution. That's a lot of merit, right? And so it is possible that at some point, in the best case scenario, negotiators will have to take a realpolitik approach. I think there's something morally horrible about that. But at least I understand sort of now why that approach exists. And the article that Tim Snyder's piece refers to, which was an article by a Russian, he's not a journalist, but a writer, I guess, Timofey Sergeyev, that was published by the biggest official news outlet, called What We Should Do with Ukraine, is a call to genocide. It's a call to erase, and I keep using the word genocide. I'm not given to using big words. I stayed away, for example, from using the word fascist, except on one occasion when I was covering the Trump era. I'm using the word genocide very advisedly because Russia has made it very clear, very explicit, that the goal of this war is to make the Ukrainian nation not exist. Right? So it's not even an ethnic cleansing project, right? A lot of people often confuse the concept of genocide with ethnic ideas. This is not exactly an ethnic idea. It's actually the project of erasing the Ukrainian nation and the Ukrainian state from the face of the earth, and that's what this article was about.
These questions are related, and they are about Putin himself. What are the conditions that enabled Putin to take control of the country in the way that he has, perhaps conditions or skills that he has? Someone is interested about his health status. Any check about the health of Putin currently? And then on a kind of a variation on the theme here, they're interested in whether you think that Putin will allow Zelensky to survive this war.
Okay, so what allowed Putin to come to power? Putin was really and truly an accidental president. I think when I wrote my book about Putin 10 years ago, it generally got positive reviews, but every so often somebody would write, yeah, but like this idea that Putin just happened to become president and that he's not very smart and not very skilled is just ridiculous on the face of it. People don't get that kind of power if they're not very smart and not very skilled and by accident. I think we now know better. But it was to a significant degree an accident. I mean, the accident was that a bunch of oligarchs and outgoing President Boris Yeltsin thought that he was such a nothing that he would be infinitely controllable, and so they could appoint him president. They could engineer his ascent to the throne, and then he would they would be able to manipulate him and maintain their power. They made a mistake, also not an unusual thing. And but what allowed him to consolidate power was in large part the throne itself, right? And I think we've also had a little bit of taste of this in this country, right? Like all this talk about how Trump was going to become presidential, right? A kind of respect that he began commanding as soon as he became president, even though he was the same Donald Trump. But in a country like Russia that has a culture of extreme respect for authority that has been literally beaten into it, that's just sitting in the chair provides a lot of power. And he, to the extent that he is skilled in sort of using that, in shoring up that the kind of charisma and authority that is based just on the magic of the chair. His health, we don't know very much about Putin. What we do know is that he's extremely worried about his health, that especially since COVID, he's been, nobody gets to spend time with him without isolating for 10 days beforehand. People, or anybody who wants to sit down with him has to pass repeated COVID tests. I mean, this is like Emmanuel Macron has to pass repeated COVID tests, and then still they sit across this ridiculously long table from each other. I'm not even sure across is the right word. It's like there's some kind of lengthwise thing that has to happen. So. There's also a report, a very well-sourced report recently by a Russian investigative journalism team in exile who have shown that he has been traveling with doctors for the last few years, and that one of those doctors is a surgeon or a surgical oncologist who specializes in thyroid cancer. That's all we know, right? So that's led to a little bit more speculation about the state of his health. But thyroid cancer is a very survivable cancer.
True. We have, I'll say final question. We'll have one more question to go to close it all up. This could be a dissertation, perhaps. So we're going to ask for a brief response. How basic or superficial is the engagement of Putin and other Russian elites with the Orthodox Church?
So it's both basic and superficial. The Russian Orthodox Church has always been a part of the Russian state. And this was true even during the Soviet period. one like great success story of Kremlin propaganda is this abiding belief in the West that religion was completely vanquished during the Soviet period. It was not vanquished; it was subjugated, and then it was used when the regime needed it. One of the things that entailed was that basically all clergy, whether Russian Orthodox, Muslim, or Jewish, had to be on the KGB payroll. And that's been fairly well documented. The legacy of that Soviet KGB church is still with us. I mean, the current patriarch comes from that period. So he and Putin come from the same corporation. They are actually deeply engaged with each other. That has absolutely nothing to do with kind of some kind of religious belief, but there is an identification with each other, and I think that Putin and his regime instrumentalize religion in the way that they instrumentalize the rest of the current ideology.
Thanks. And you all should know that Masha Gessen has spent the entire day speaking with various groups of people here at ASU. We're really grateful for your energy, for your time, for your brain, for helping us think through some of these ideas and challenges. We thought we'd ask you a question that was a little more personal with regards to the status of the world. And this is a hat tip to a friend named Rabbi Emily Langowitz, who suggested these questions, and hello to the people who are online. I believe she's one of them. What keeps you up at night? And what kinds of things give you hope, help you enact hope when you get up in the morning?
Well, what keeps me up at night is obviously my children. That's and I don't mean, that they're so young that they wake me up at night. I mean, I worry about them. What gives me hope? I mean, I've actually, for this current interminable book project, I've been thinking a lot about hope and reading a lot about hope. And I will come back again to Eric Fromm and his writing on hope, and then Paulo Freire, who picked up Fromm's ideas and wrote about them in the pedagogy of the oppressed. And they both have the idea of hope as an active pursuit, right? That Fromm draws a distinction between blind faith, for which he has no use, and which I think in this country might also call optimism. It's this idea that, things will kind of take care of themselves. And hope, which, and I love this phrase of his, he has this phrase, the certainty of the reality of the possibility. If I can get away with it, I'm going to call my next book that. So Fromm has this idea that you create something that creates the certainty of the reality of the possibility of a better future. And that's what gives you hope. And the hope feeds the action. And so you create hope on a daily basis. And so I think of hope as a moral imperative, and without sounding too grandiose about it, like I get up and, lately, yes, since the war started, I've been waking up feeling like Russians have this great expression, you wake up feeling like an enormous toad is sitting in your chest. So of course I wake up feeling like an enormous toad is sitting in my chest. But I have all these resources to try to create hope, and that's my job.
Thank you so much, Masha. It sounds like we've got democracy as a verb and hope as a verb.
On behalf of the faculty in Justice and Social Inquiry in the School of Social Transformation, I want to thank you for joining us for the 22nd John P. Frank Memorial Lecture. At SST, we really try to extend the legacy of John P. Frank by preparing our graduates to analyze really difficult, entrenched social problems and try to break boundaries and build a more just society. On this historic week, when the first Black woman, Ketanji Brown Jackson, has been confirmed to join the Supreme Court, we want to acknowledge John P. Frank's judicial legacy and remember the speakers that we've hosted here over these years, including several of them who report on and provide critical insights into the Supreme Court, such as Linda Greenhouse, Neil Katyal last year, Nina Totenberg, and others who have actually served as Supreme Court justices, including Sonia Sotomayor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, may she rest in peace, and also Sandra Day O'Connor, may she also rest in peace. We want to also honor the legacy of our inaugural speaker, Professor Lani Guinier, who passed away sadly this year. With your participation as donors and attendees, we hope to continue this tradition of inviting individuals who engage in critical efforts to protect democracy and pursue justice. So thank you very much. Be safe on your way home and have a wonderful night. Thank you so much, Masha Gessen.